The alarm had been ringing for 20 minutes. Not a soft chime, not a gentle pulse. A sharp, relentless cry. The kind Amara had set herself because she knew how deeply she slept when she was afraid. And she had been afraid last night. Terrified, actually, not of failing the interview, of wanting it too much. Matteo Rossi stood in the doorway of her room. He had been standing there for 6 of Pratt, those 20 minutes, still dressed, tie already knotted at his throat, coffee cooling in his hand, his eyes on her face, the way it softened in sleep, the way her lips parted slightly, the way she looked like someone who hadn't carried the weight of the entire world on her shoulders for the past 4 months. The alarm screamed. He didn't move. He told himself he was giving her 1 more minute, then another. Then it wasn't about minutes anymore. At 9:47 a.m., Amara Offer opened her eyes. She woke the way she always did, with purpose. Eyes open, brain already running. She reached for her phone with the automatic confidence of someone who had planned everything, prepared everything, controlled everything she possibly could. She saw the time. Her body went cold before her mind caught up. 9:47. The interview had been at 9:09. The Accademia Romana International Fellowship. The one that had kept her awake for 11 weeks. The one she had flown across the continent for. The one she had rewritten her research proposal 4 times 4 in a language that was not her first. In a city that was not her home. Surrounded by people who did not yet know her name. 9. Her hands were shaking. Before she realized she was sitting up, she called the fellowship office. It rang 3 times. A woman answered, polite, clipped, apologetic in that Roman way that left no room for argument. Signorina Offer, the panel has concluded. We were unable to reach you. I'm sorry. She didn't hear the rest. She lowered the phone. The apartment was quiet. Morning light fell flat and pale through the windows. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the soft tick of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator. She stood slowly, walked to the doorway. Matteo Rossi was at the kitchen counter, dressed, composed, coffee in hand, reading something on his phone as though the morning had arrived and departed, exactly as expected. He looked up, their eyes met. And in the space between them, 3 of marble floor and 4 months of something neither of them had named, she felt it. He knew. You were awake, she said. It wasn't a question. To understand what happened in that hallway, you have to go back to October. Amara had arrived in Rome with 1 suitcase, 1 folder of documents, and the Ramsana-Leifer, particular kind of confidence that comes not from certainty, but from having no backup plan. She was 26 years old, a public health researcher from Lagos, and she had applied to the Accademia Romana Fellowship 6 times before she was shortlisted. 6 times. Each rejection, a door closed quietly in her face. Each new application written with more precision, more hunger, more of herself, pressed into the margins. When the shortlist email arrived, she was sitting in a bus in Accra, sweating through her blazer in traffic that hadn't moved in 40 minutes. She read it 3 times. Then she put her phone in her bag and stared out the window and didn't let herself celebrate yet because she knew the Rosen distance between shortlisted and selected. And she had learned not to fall in love with things before they were hers. She found the apartment through a university housing board, affordable, clean, 10 minutes from the fellowship, building by Metro. The landlord was listed only as M. Rossi. He opened the door on a Sunday morning, and her first thought was that he looked like someone who had never in his life been late for anything. He was tall, lean in a way that suggested discipline rather than genetics. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that moved over her face and her folder of documents with the same flat, efficient assessment. He didn't smile. He checked her paperwork, handed her the keys, explained the building rules in precise, lightly accented English, and left. She thought, this man will never bother me. She was wrong, but not in the way she expected. Matteo was the managing director of a mid-sized investment firm on Via Veneto. He worked from 7 to 7 most days and came home smelling of boardrooms and espresso. He did not socialize. He did not make noise. He did not knock on her door. But, slowly, strangely, they began to share the kitchen. It started with timing. She cooked late after her evening study sessions, sometimes past 10. He ate late, after his calls with Milan and London. The first time they found themselves at the stove at the same hour, they barely spoke. He moved to one side. She moved to the other, and they coexisted with the practiced courtesy of strangers. But strangers don't stay strangers when the kitchen is small and the nights are long. She asked him once, a Wednesday, the third week, if he had eaten the ginger she'd left on the counter. He said yes, apologized. She said it was fine. She'd bought too much anyway. That was it. 40 seconds of conversation. But the following evening, there was a fresh bundle of ginger on the counter. No note. She looked at it for a moment, and something small and warm moved through her chest that she immediately ignored. By November, they were eating at the same table. Not together, not deliberately, just two people who happened to sit down at the same time in the same small kitchen with their separate meals and their separate silences. But the silences changed. They deepened, became comfortable, in a way that surprised her because Amara was not a person who found silence comfortable. She had grown up in a house full of voices, her mother's laughter, her brother's arguments, the television always running, the neighborhood always loud. Silence to her had always meant something was wrong. But Matteo's silence felt different. It felt like presence. She caught herself telling him things she hadn't planned to say. Small things at first, that the metro was delayed, that her Italian tutor had canceled, that she'd gotten a new comment on her research paper. He would listen, respond in short, precise sentences, ask one question, exactly one, that cut straight to the center of whatever she'd said. He was not warm, but he was real. And in a city where she was still learning how to exist, real was something. They never talked about whatever was building between them. Neither of them reached for it or named it or gave it room. But it was there. In the way he would refill her tea without asking. In the way she would leave the kitchen light on when she heard his key in the lock at midnight. In the way they had both stopped pretending they didn't notice the other one. The night before, the interview, everything unraveled. It was past 11 when Amara came home from the library. Matteo was still up, unusual, sitting at the kitchen table with a document spread open, reading glasses low on his nose. He looked up when she came in. "You're late," he said. "I know." She dropped her bag on the chair. "I was going over my presentation for tomorrow." He studied her for a moment. "How many times have you reviewed it today?" 11. Something moved across his face. "Sit down," she almost argued, but she sat. He made tea, the good kind she'd brought from Lagos, the tin she kept on the second shelf, and only opened when things were bad. She noticed that. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her without comment. "Tell me about the fellowship," he said. She stared at him. "You want to hear about it now?" "Yes." So she told him all of it. Not the polished version she'd been rehearsing for the panel, but the real version, the 6 rejections, the research proposal she'd rewritten until her eyes bled, the 3 months of phone interviews and written assessments, and what felt like proving over and over that she deserved to be in this room, in this city, at this table. The way her mother had cried when she got the short list, the way her own hands had shaken. She didn't realize she was crying until Matteo pushed a folded napkin across the table. She laughed a short broken sound and pressed it to her eyes. "Sorry, I don't." She shook her head. "I don't usually do this." "I know," he said, and somehow from him that meant something different than it would have from anyone else. Not judgment, just acknowledgement. He had been paying attention. They sat in silence for a while after that. The good kind. Then she stood to go, to bed. "Matteo." She paused in the doorway. He looked up. "Please wake me at 7. No, matter what." Even if I fight you, even if I say, 5 more minutes, don't listen to me. He held her gaze for a moment. 7. Promise me. A pause, brief. So brief, she almost didn't notice it. I'll wake you, he said. She trusted him completely, the way she had trusted very few people in her life. Not blindly, but specifically because she had watched him and decided he was someone who meant what he said. She went to sleep. He did not wake her. You were awake, she said, and again, he didn't deny it. That was what broke something in her. The fact that he didn't even try to lie. Matteo. Her voice was very careful. What time did you get up? At 6:30. And you heard the alarm. A long pause. Yes. The word fell between them like something thrown from a height. She looked at him. This man she had trusted. This man who had listened to her cry the night before. This man who had made her tea and said, I'll wake you, with a steadiness that she had taken into her chest and slept on. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just anger, betrayal. I asked you for one thing, she said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her. One thing. And you said, you're responsible for your own life, Amara. The words were flat, clinical, like something said to end a meeting. She went still. He was looking at his phone, now. His jaw was set. His eyes were empty in that way she had once found calm, and now recognized as armor. She turned around, walked back to her room, and closed the door with exactly the force of someone who had decided not to scream. The days that followed were a specific kind of agony. She did not leave. She had nowhere to go. Her lease ran through January, and she could not afford to break it. So, they lived in the same apartment, moved through the same hallway, breathed the same air, and said nothing. She stopped eating in the kitchen when he was home. She would wait until she heard his door close or until she was certain he'd left for work, and then she would move quietly through the Banses' apartment like someone trying not to exist. She took her meals to her room. She stopped leaving the kitchen light on. He noticed. She knew he noticed because Matteo noticed everything. He was a man who cataloged details the way other stanches people breathed automatically continuously without appearing to try. She had found that quality fascinating once. Now it felt like surveillance. But she was not petty enough to pretend she felt nothing. The truth, the ugly, inconvenient truth was that the missed interview had gutted her professionally. But Matteo's silence gutted her in a way that went deeper because she had let him in. She had sat at that table and told him everything, and cried in front of him. And he had listened like he cared. And then he had let her miss the most important morning of her life, and stood in his kitchen afterward, as though nothing had happened. She replayed it constantly, looking for a version that made sense. A version where she'd misunderstood, where he had tried and failed to wake her, where there was an explanation she hadn't heard yet, but he had not offered one. He had said, "You're responsible for your own life," as though she hadn't spent every day of her 26 years proving exactly that. She began looking at flights. Across the hallway, Matteo Rossi was doing what he did when he didn't know what else to do. He worked. He arrived at the office at 6:45, which was 20 minutes earlier than usual. He stayed until 8, 9, sometimes 10. He reviewed contracts that didn't need reviewing, sat in on calls he could have delegated, restructured a quarterly projection twice in one afternoon because the first version was correct, but he needed his hands to keep moving. His assistant asked if he was all right. He said yes. She looked at him with the expression his assistant reserved for situations she had decided not to involve herself in. He was not all right. He had stood in that doorway for 20 minutes. He had heard her, breathing slow and steady below the alarm's cry. He had thought about waking her, had stood with his hand raised close to the door, close to her shoulder, and in the final moment he had not moved because the night before, while she was in the shower preparing for bed, he had stood in the hallway and heard her call. Her mother. He had not meant to listen. He was passing, but the words stopped him. I got into the second round. Mama, a pause, a laugh, bright and proud. If I get this fellowship, I won't have to worry anymore. The stipend is enough to finish the research and go home. I could come home, Mama. Maybe by spring. Home. He had walked to his room, sat on the edge of his bed, and something he had not expected to feel, something quiet and desperate and entirely unreasonable, had moved through him like a current. He had not let himself examine it. He was not a man who examined feelings. He managed them, filed them, moved on. But that night, the feeling wouldn't file. It sat at the base of his chest and pressed upward. And in the morning when the alarm rang, he had stood in her doorway, thought, if she gets this, she leaves. And he hadn't moved. He knew clearly and immediately that what he had done was wrong. He had known it while he was doing it. But knowing something is wrong and stopping yourself are two different things. And Matteo Rossi, who had stopped himself from doing wrong things his entire life, who had built his whole identity on that discipline, had failed, not because he was careless, because he was afraid. And fear was the one thing he had never learned to handle. What he told her, you're responsible for your own life, was not callousness. It was panic. It was a man reaching for the armor he'd always worn, and finding it didn't quite cover the wound this time. But she didn't know that, and he couldn't find the way to say it, so he worked. 3 weeks passed. The apartment became something neither of them could name. Not quite hostile, not quite bearable. They moved around each other with the elaborate politeness of two people who had once been something and were now trying to pretend they hadn't been. Amara's friends back home called. She told them she was fine. She was not fine. She had submitted 2 alternative fellowship applications, one in London, one in Accra, and had received 1 rejection and 1 deferral. She was running low on savings. She was running low on optimism, which was worse. And she was still, despite everything, thinking about him. That was what humiliated her most. Not the missed meeting, not the caring, closed doors. It was that she could still hear him saying her name across the kitchen table, could still feel the quality of his attention, the rare, complete attention of someone who had chosen to be fully present with her. She had not imagined it. She knew she hadn't, which made what he'd done more confusing, not less. On a Thursday evening in late November, she came home and found him in the par's hallway, not passing through, standing there like he'd been waiting. She moved to go past him. He said her name. Amara. She stopped, didn't turn. I owe you an explanation. You told me everything I needed to know. She said I'm responsible for my own life. That's not. He stopped. She heard him exhale. That wasn't what I meant to say. She turned then because she needed to see his face when he said whatever he was about to say. He was looking at the floor. That surprised her. Matteo, who always looked at things directly, who had a way of holding eye contact that felt like a quiet assertion of power, was looking at the floor. I was awake, he said. I heard the alarm. I heard it, and I stood there and he stopped again. I chose not to wake you. I know that. I didn't tell you why. She waited. He looked up, and for the first time since she had known him, his face was not controlled. I heard you on the phone the night before with your mother. A pause. You said if you got the fellowship, you'd go home in spring. She stared at him. And you? She couldn't finish the sentence. She tried again. You let me miss it because of that. Not because of that. His voice was strained. Because he pressed his mouth shut, opened it again because I didn't want you to leave. The silence after that was enormous. She felt the anger move through her, sharp and righteous, and underneath it, something much more complicated, something that frightened her more than the anger did. Matteo, she said slowly. Do you understand what you took from me? Yes. Do you understand that no explanation makes that acceptable? Yes, she believed him. That was the terrible part. She could see it on his face, the specific shame of a person who had done something indefensible and knew it, who was not asking for forgiveness, who was only, finally telling the truth. She walked past him, went to her room, and sat on her bed for a long time, looking at the airline app she had open on her phone for 2 weeks. She booked the flight on a Sunday. Lagos, December 16th. One way. She didn't tell him. She started packing quietly, the way she'd started doing, everything in the apartment, carefully, minimally, taking up as little space as possible. But Mateo heard the suitcase. Of course he did. He appeared in her open doorway, looked at the half-packed bag, then at her. "You're leaving?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The fellowships. There are fellowships in other cities." She folded a sweater. "There are always other opportunities. I'll find them." She said it the way she had learned to say hard things, with the flatness of someone who had made peace with them, even when she hadn't. He didn't move from the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough." "It's not." She set down the sweater. "But I believe you mean it." "Amara, don't." She turned to face him. "Please don't ask me to stay. You don't get to do that." Something crossed his face. He nodded once. She turned back to the bag and then quietly, so quietly she almost missed it. Was it really just the meeting? As she went, still, the question hung in the air between them, and she understood it the way she understood most of what he said. Not from the words themselves, but from the space underneath them. He wasn't asking about the fellowship. She turned slowly. "No," she said. "It wasn't just the meeting." His eyes held hers. "It was you," she said. "It was the fact that you made me feel like I could trust you. And then you proved that I couldn't." "You can," he said. And his voice was raw in a way she had never heard from him before. Raw and cracked at the edges, like something that had been held under pressure too long and was finally giving. "I know I have no right to say that now, but you can." She shook her head. "You have to earn that back," she said. "And I can't wait here while you figure out how." She went back to packing. He left the doorway. The night before she left, neither of them slept. She knew he was awake because she could hear him. Not sounds exactly, but the quality of his stillness, the way the apartment held differently when he was in it and alert. She had learned to read the textures of this space the way she had learned to read the textures of his silence, without trying, without meaning to. She lay in the dark and thought about Lagos, her mother's kitchen, the sound of the generator kicking on at night, the particular smell of petrol on red earth after the first rain. She thought about Mateo, drinking tea across from her at 11:30 at night, asking her one precise question that went straight to the center of everything. She thought about the way he had stood in her doorway, not begging, not demanding, just there, broken open, finally too late. She was not someone who stayed where she was not wanted. That was the rule she had built her life on, the rule that had got her out of every doopy room that tried to shrink her, across every border that tried to stop her. She moved toward the things she wanted, and when a door closed, she found another one, but she had never had a door close that she had wanted to walk through this badly. At 4 inches the morning, she heard Mateo's door open, his footsteps in the crime hall. She held her breath. They stopped outside her room. She waited. He didn't knock. After a long moment, the footsteps moved away. She closed her eyes. Fiumicino International Airport, December 16th. Terminal 2, Gate 34. Amara stood in the boarding queue with her carry-on and her coat and her face as composed as she could make it, which was not very composed. She had not cried yet. She was saving it for the plane, the particular luxury of headphones and altitude and the anonymity of 30,000 feet. The gate agent began calling Rose. She moved forward with the queue, 1 step, 2. She pulled out her boarding pass and her passport, checked them without seeing them, looked up at the departure board. Rome to Lagos, Mr. Muhammad. Boarding on time. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. Safe flight. My girl will be waiting. She smiled at it, small and real. Amara. She froze. The sound of her name in that voice, quiet, precise, slightly hoarse, hit her somewhere that had no name. She turned. Matteo Rossi was standing 20 meters back at the edge of the boarding area. He was not dressed for the office. Dark coat, no tie, hair slightly less perfect than usual. He looked like a man who had driven very fast and parked incorrectly and run through an airport for the first time in his life. He was breathing hard. The queue moved, and around her. She didn't move. He walked toward her, stopped just close enough to talk. You came, she said. I should have come sooner. His voice was quiet but steady. I should have said this sooner. I kept waiting until I had the right words. And then I realized I was doing the same thing I always do. Waiting until I had control before I allowed myself to feel something. She looked at him. I was afraid. He said just that, flat and direct and completely without armor. When I heard you say you were going home, I was afraid in a way I didn't know how to manage. And instead of telling you, I chose the one option that guaranteed I wouldn't have to face it. You let me miss the most important meeting of my life. Yes. Because you were afraid of losing me. Yes. And that fear, she stopped, swallowed. That fear was exactly what caused you to lose me. He held her gaze, did not look away. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm not asking you to forgive it today or next week or maybe ever. He paused. I'm only asking you to know that I see it clearly for what it is. Not as discipline, not as logic, cowardice. She had not expected that word. It moved through her. You didn't trust me, she said. No, you didn't trust that I'd choose to stay. No. Something flickered in his face, but more than that, I didn't trust myself to let you go. To be someone who could love something and not hold it so tightly it broke. The boarding call crackled over the intercom. Final boarding for flight K533 Rome Fiumicino to Lagos. She looked at her boarding pass. He said nothing else, did not reach for her, did not close the distance. He stood exactly where he was and let the choice belong entirely to her. That was what finally moved her. Not the words, not the fact that he'd come, but the fact that having come, having said everything, he was now standing still, not pulling, not pressing, not taking anything, just present, just honest, just him. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the gate agent glanced over, long enough to feel the full weight of what she was deciding. If I stay, she said, you don't get to hold me tightly. I know. If I stay, I'm still going to pursue the fellowship. I'm still going to build the life I came here for. I know. And if you ever, her voice caught just for a moment. If you ever again make a choice like that, choosing fear over honesty, I won't come back from the next airport. I know, he said, and then, I won't. She believed him. She did not know if she was right to believe him. She did not know if this was wisdom or weakness. She did not know if the heart that had been quietly assembling itself around this man for 4 months was sound enough to be trusted, or if she was simply standing in an airport, exhausted and heartbroken, and choosing the familiar ache of him over the unfamiliar distance of going home. But she believed him, and she had crossed enough oceans on belief to know that sometimes that was enough to start with. She looked at her boarding pass one last time. Then she looked at him. Then, don't make me regret staying. She dropped the ticket. His eyes closed briefly, the smallest possible collapse of composure, the space of one breath. And when they opened, something in his face had shifted. Not softened exactly, deepened, like a room where the furniture hasn't changed. But the light has. He didn't touch her. They stood in the middle of the boarding area while passengers streamed past them, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded attention she had once found at a kitchen table and thought she had lost. I won't, he said, and the way he said it, without performance, without pressure, with the quiet, weight of someone who had just made a decision about who they were going to be. She held on to that sentence the whole way back. They did not fall in love cleanly after that. There was no clean version to fall into. What had happened was real, and real things leave real marks, and pretending otherwise would have been another kind of lie, and they had both had enough of those. She reapplied for the Academia Romana Fellowship. The coordinator, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Rossi, told her a new cohort would open in March, and her previous evaluation scores were strong enough to carry forward. March felt far away. She made it, close by working. She and Matteo moved around each other carefully at first, tentatively, like two people relearning a language they'd spoken badly before and were determined to speak better. He did not take up space he hadn't been offered. She did not offer space she wasn't ready to give, but the kitchen was still small, and the nights were still long. He came home one evening in January to find her at the table mid-cry over a particularly brutal peer review of her research paper. He sat down across from her, asked what was wrong. She told him, the whole ugly version, not the edited one. He listened, asked one question. This time she didn't try to stop herself from thinking that was exactly what she'd needed. She began leaving the kitchen light on again. He began buying the good ginger. February arrived and Rome was cold enough to hurt, and they started walking sometimes on Sunday mornings. No destination, just the city and the quiet and the space between them that was slowly, carefully becoming something, or else. It was not perfect. She called him out when his walls went up directly, without softening it because she had learned that softening it let him pretend he hadn't done it. He learned to notice the walls before she had to. Not always, but more. She had dinner with Dr. Rossi in late February to discuss the new cohort. She came home and told Matteo about it at the kitchen table, and he listened, really listened, the way he had that first night. And when she finished, he said, I want you to get it. She looked at him. I mean that, he said. Whatever it means, however long it takes, I want you to get what you came here for. She held his gaze for a long moment. I know, she said, and she did. The fellowship letter arrived on a Thursday morning in March. She was alone when she opened it. Matteo had already left for work, the apartment quiet and pale, with early light. She stood in the kitchen and read it twice. Then she sat down. Then she laughed. A long, full sound that echoed off the walls of this small apartment she had come to know like a second skin. She called her mother first. Then she sent Matteo a message. Just 3 words. I got it. His reply came within 30 seconds, which meant he was at his desk and had his phone face up, which meant he had been waiting. I know you would. She put her phone down on the table and looked at the acceptance letter and felt not arrival. Exactly. Not yet, because arrival was still ahead of her, still to be earned, still to be built. But the particular feeling of standing at the edge of the life she had always been moving toward and knowing for the first time in a long time that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That evening, Matteo came home at 6:15, earlier than usual. He looked at her across the kitchen, this woman who had arrived in his apartment with one suitcase and changed the entire architecture of his interior life, and something in him that had been braced for a very long time finally quietly let go. Congratulations, he said. Thank you. He stood in the kitchen doorway, coat still on, and looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of everything he'd spent 4 months learning to feel. She met his eyes, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Not yet, she meant, and maybe for a long time. And maybe after that she would go to conferences, to field work, to the many cities her work would eventually take her. And he would learn to let her go, and trust her to come back, because trust was not something you declared. It was something you practiced over and over in small daily decisions. But tonight she was here, and that was enough. He finally came into the kitchen and she made tea, her tea from the tin on the second shelf. And they sat at the same small table, in the same small kitchen, and talked until midnight about everything and nothing. The way two people talk when they are no longer performing for each other and are simply finally being. The next morning, the alarm rang at 7. Amara stirred. Matteo was already awake. He had been awake for a while, not standing, in a doorway this time, not watching, not hesitating. He was moving, water, running, kettle heating, filling the morning with the particular sounds of someone who intended to be present in it. The alarm rang once more. He knocked on her door. Amara, 7. A beat, then muffled and warm from the other side of toot in the door. I hear it. He smiled. First one in a long time. Small, private, real. He went back to the kitchen, poured 2 cups, set one on her side of the table. The morning light came in pale and steady through the window. And this time, he didn't hesitate. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. New stories drop every week. And tell me in the comments, was Amara right to stay, or would you have walked through that gate?